Okay, so now we're gonna review about research methods, and we're just going to make a very brief review about what psychology is about and what constitutes it as a good theory. So first of all, psychology is the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. Behavior are observable actions, and mental processes involves thinking or cognition. And how we do this in psychology is basically by making good theories regarding, the behavior and mental processes that humans have. And in order to have a good theory, it should be based on a hypothesis, backed up by evidence. It can be tested or it can be studied, and it is also usually based on some assumptions or principles that defines thinking for behavior. So, at least in IB psychology, when they say backed up by evidence, they refer to empirical evidence or studies, which usually consist of aim, procedure, results, conclusions, and findings. And there are several ways of conducting a study, mainly quantitative and qualitative. So quantitative studies are studies that uses data approach, or what you call as nomothetic approach. So they usually quantize your behaviors and observe them after you quantize the behaviors. So you quantize the behaviors and then use those data to analyze and to see if the data is valid. So it uses a more objective approach. Well, for qualitative, you use a more idiographic approach, aka a more insightful approach more than just data. So you actually go in depth about the human experience, interpretations, and meanings, and it's more subjective. So if you're still confused about these two terms, which I think if you've already studied it, it should be very clear what the differences are. Then just remember quantitative, quantity quantitative, and qualitative. So quantity is number, and qualitative means quality, and quality relates to rich data instead of the shallow kind of numerical data. Yeah. And then now we go into the general definitions of sampling, credibility, generalizability, bias, and additional terms that you should know. So sampling is basically a way to find individuals to produce accurate results, like a technique to do so. And it's remember that it's important for you to find a representative sample for your experiments, for your studies, because you're going to have to use these data to explain about your theories and to talk about your target population. Credibility is how trustworthy or how reliable, how valid your data is. If your data isn't credible, then it usually has a bias. For generalizability is how far the studies can be used in other situations. And this can take many different forms of generalizability, which we will explain further later. A bias is an inclination, predisposition, prejudice towards something. So usually relates to something like that's unfair. That's judged in a subjective way. Yeah, it judged in a subjective way that's not very fair. Okay, some additional terms you need to know. So retrospective versus prospective. This is, I think, a more I think this relates to interviews. Retrospective is asking about past behavior, while prospective measures a variable in the beginning and watch its effects over time. So this is I don't think you have to like note these very well, just review to familiarize yourself with these terms, because sometimes they may be used in studies, but if it's not used in studies, then you don't really have to know. And then longitudinal research and cross-sectional research. Longitudinal research is the kind of research where you observe behavior in a long time. So it can be like a 2-week observation, but like maybe longer, or it can also be experiments in maybe like every 3 months. That would also count as longitudinal. Even it can be quantitative or qualitative. Well, for cross-sectional research, they usually analyze the data collected at once, but in different stages of life. So, for example, they measure the smoking. They measure how much people are smoking, and they measure it per age difference. So, from 10 to 20, and then 20 to 30, 30 to 40, and etc. etc. And then finally, we have construct and operationalizations. So, a construct is a definition of a variable based on theory. Usually, like certain behaviors, or actually certain like maybe like certain behaviors are hard to observe, or it's kind of hard to make a construct of it. Like, let's say we have aggression. How do we measure aggression? It's kind of hard to say. So you have to define it so that we can measure it. That's a construct. And operationalization is how well you're like creating that construct in behavior. So like, let's just say you want to measure aggression to how delinquent someone is, which is actually about operationalization, but that's one example of it. Okay, then we have ethics. So we commonly have 2 types of ethics, which is the ethical considerations when you're doing the study, and the ethical considerations in reporting your results. So when doing the study, some of the ethical considerations that you can consider would be informed consent, protection from harm, anonymity and confidentiality, withdrawal from the participation, deception, debriefing, and in special cases you can have cost-benefit analysis. So, okay, let's revisit these terms one by one. Informed consent is wants you to make sure that participation is voluntary and that the participants knows what they're doing when they're joining the study. Well, protection from harm is that basically participants should be protected from physical or mental harm. And this also includes potential long-term negative consequences. So if you think a study might cause anxiety or distress, let's just say something like you want to do a study similar to the Bobo doll experiment where you expose children to aggressive behavior, we don't know if that kid would be negatively affected if they witnessed those kind of behaviors. So you have to consider that and protect them from harm, just in case if that happens. Anonymity and confidentiality. So you have to make sure that the participant's identity is anonymous, and you also mustn't leak their personal data. withdrawal from participation. So researchers can't force participants from withdrawal if they would like to withdraw like suddenly. It should be fully voluntary, but sometimes there are some issues with this, and it will be explained later in the biases of quantitative research. Okay, deception. So deception can be used in certain circumstances to prevent bias. So, the thing with deception is like if you tell participants the aim of the study, sometimes they can have like assumptions about what might happen. So they might confirm and do that, or they might actually rebel and purposely like ruin the study's results instead of their natural behavior. So sometimes people do deception, but it should be minimalized just in case if any just in case if like the participants might not be comfortable with like deception or the aim of the study or the nature of the study. Debriefing. Participants should be well informed of the aims of the study, the nature of it, and how the data will be used. See, this is the reason why deception is kind of like why sometimes psychologists might use deception, and after the experiment is done, deceptions should be revealed and potential harm should be taken care of, and that involves like psychological help if something happens to them. Then last but not least, we have cost-benefit analysis in ambiguous cases. So there are some circumstances when relaxing ethical standards can be done. So if for example, after analyzing, there is a chance that the study might have a significant effect in society, like a very good positive effect in society, then maybe the deception can be done just for the study so that like it's for the future good. Or if there's no way the experiment can be conducted without relaxing the ethical standards, they can also be done. But obviously, you have to make sure that it can be beneficial in the long term. So the ethics committee plays a role in resolving these ambiguous cases. Usually they have like this one committee where they would evaluate your studies and make sure that they're good. Now we're going to ethical considerations in reporting the results. So the first, we have data fabrication. Obviously, it's wrong to fabricate and fake your data because that is not representative of like reality, and you're also not supposed to plagiarize because that is going against like general academic integrity. And there's also publication credit. So the authorship should reflect the contribution of the author. So a professor shouldn't be authoring a work that's like mainly done by their student. And you shouldn't put other people's name in front of your name if just because you feel bad or you want to like put it in like an alphabetical order or something. And then next up we have sharing research data for verification. So I think this is more of a like an encouraging like good integrity and like sharing of data kind of thing. So basically researchers shouldn't withhold data, but it would be encouraged if like other independent researchers ask if their data is shared for like the future contribution of more psychological progress, And then next up we have the handling of sensitive personal information. Okay, this can sometimes be used in SAQs or ERQs. So for example, in the handling information in genetic research, the information related to genetics like twin studies, kinship studies, or family studies, or health status should be handled with care to prevent possible consequences. So, like imagine if like you conduct a study about twins and like their link with depression, and then later after the study is published, some medias talk about like this particular study, and then this one twin who knows that their other twin is depressed starts happen to jump into that article. Like imagine how they'd feel. So yeah, so these kind of things, they might feel like down or something, or negatively affected by it, because they think that they might also have a chance that they might get depression, and like the negative mental stigma that comes with it. So it's important to like handle these kind of informations with care and word it carefully. Oh, and same thing with mental disorders because of the bad stigma that they have. Next up, we have social implications of reporting scientific results. Like I explained before, when a study is published and like reported by the media or talked by the media, there might be a chance that they might accidentally misinterpret the study or etc. if you're not careful with your wording. For example, like if you say, oh, behavior, let's just say aggression is associated with genetics, and then associated means a link, right? A correlation. But then the media, after reading the scientific journal, goes like, oh, association, does that mean causation? Oh, so genetics causes aggression, guys. I will share this to the to other general people who have no idea of the actual study, and imagine how that end up like. Yeah, so you should consider about the social implications before you report something like that, and be very careful, especially if something is like that thing is very controversial. Okay, now we can finally jump into quantitative studies. So quantitative studies operate in variables and uses objective measurements. So they try to like turn behavior into data and analyze the data and see if it's like significant or not. Okay, so one of the things that is kind of important to consider in quantitative studies is that there's this big thing which is confounding variables, or deterrent variable, or extraneous variables. This particular variable might distort the IV and DV relationship. So it's very important to control, eliminate, or keep them constant so they don't cause bias. Okay, now we jump into quantitative research methods. The first one being experimental studies, which is the classic lab study. And it usually tries to determine whether there's a cause-effect relationship between two variables. You usually start with the hypothesis, which predicts the relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable. Remember, independent is basically the variable that's being manipulated, while the dependent variable is the variable that changes depending on the independent variable. So there's two hypothesis, which is the experimental hypothesis or null hypothesis. The experimental hypothesis is sometimes called as an alternative hypothesis for some people, and it's the one that predicts that the IV will have effect on VV, while the null hypothesis it predicts that IV will have no effect on VV. So there are several experimental designs that psychologists usually use. There's the repeated measures design. So what the repeated measures design do is they compare conditions. They repeat the procedure of like different conditions and then compare them later. So the good thing about this is they're kind of usually useful if you don't have a lot of participants, or if you want to like compare the same participants' behavior with like before and after kind of thing. Because you're comparing you're comparing the participants to themselves, the results of it. So it's good. However, there's also order effects. Basically, like the order of the experiment can cause differences in the study, but this can usually be easily countered by counterbalancing. And then another issue about repeated measure design is that it tends to develop demand characteristics, because if a participant keeps on repeating the study, then they would start to guess like the purpose of the study, and that can affect their natural behavior. And then there's also the possible confounding variables for the material contents, because if the material contents differs, then there might be differences in like how hard it is or how easy it is. Let's just say you have an experiment which asks people to read a reading assignment, like do a reading assignment. And if you have different reading assignments, there might be a difference with how hard it is. Next up, we have independent measures design. Usually this is where participants are randomly allocated to one condition or another, like A or B. So this is usually, oh, did I got disconnected? What happened? Wait, hold on, let me fix this. Okay. Hello, I'm back. It's gonna be like that sometimes. Yeah, okay. I'm just not gonna stream. Hopefully that is my internet better? Oh no, I got disconnected again. Oh jeez, this is kind of concerning, but well. Okay, this is very concerning. Oh, I'm finally back. Please don't disconnect again. Okay, so did I get caught up in like independent measures design? Or okay. Okay, so thank God I don't need to explain repeated measures design again. Okay, so for independent measures design, participants are usually randomly placed in like one condition or another, usually A or B or A or B or C. The good thing with this is that the order of effect is controlled. So if like you do an experiment, the participants aren't gonna be doing the experiment twice, so it doesn't really matter, like on the order effect. And since it's randomly allocated, and if there's enough participants, like big sample size, then the potential confounding variables usually cancels each other out. So like if you have one extremes and then another extremes, then when you average it out, it's okay. Okay, but for the limitations, since you have you have participants placed in like every group, there might be a chance that there's this thing called participant variability, and this would affect the sample size if this would affect the results if the sample size is small. Like this is probably what happens when the extremes doesn't cancel out, and the participant different participant behavior results in affecting like the actual final results. Then we have match pair design. So match pairs design is kind of similar to independent sample design, but before they get randomized, they get matched in the groups first. So let's say they would try to measure let's just say they want to measure how often you smoke, and then they want to do a study related to it. So before they do the experiment on you, they start grouping you by your age first, and it like age intervals. So maybe there's like 20 till 25, 25 till 30, and etc. etc. And after you're grouped like that, in each of the groups, you get randomly allocated to the conditions they have in the experiment. So this would be helpful if you have a small sample size, and it's also helpful when you cannot prevent order of effect. However, it would be fairly time-consuming and kind of annoying to deal with because of the complicated design that you have. Then, okay, next we have sampling in quantitative studies. So there's random sampling where every member of the population, everyone has equal chance to be participant. This is good because it takes account of like all characteristics in target population. So even if there are minorities, there are extremes, they regardless, like you're taking the majority and you're getting the majority's characteristics. It's also easily generalizable since participants is representing the population. However, it can be very impractical because not everyone has access to like taking randomly sampling a population. You can only do that if like you're part of the government or something and you require like the experiment to happen, but you know how experiments are supposed to be with consent and voluntary, so usually it's kind of hard for this to happen unless it's a like literally government inspection. Yeah, so however, yeah, the thing with this is that it also needs a big sample size if the target population is huge. Especially if the target population is like varies a lot, especially like let's just say city people, because there are usually like very okay, even if city people is like consisting of certain people with certain behaviors, you have to also take account how like usually city people also have people from the suburban area or people coming from foreign places. So yeah, let's just say in a big city, that would be kind of hard to deal with. And then we have stratified sampling. So you take the essential characteristics of the population, and then you try to like measure like the percentage of the characteristics of the population and try to represent them equally in the sample that we're going to have. So this, yeah, for example, if you have like a population with a male gender majority, let's just say 55%, and then 45% females, then when you do stratified sampling, your final sample should be 55% male and 45% female. But it still has to be taken randomly. So this is good if you want to get a sample that represents the population with relevant characteristics, but it can be time consuming to like do that procedure. And then we also have opportunity sampling. So these are usually college freshmen and rats. It's very easy to sample them, but most of the time they only represent college freshmen, and that's not a very good representation of a population. And we have, last but not least, we have self-selected sampling. So usually volunteers are recruited and picked through advertisements that are like placed in newspapers, university, whatever place for like bulletin announcements. This is very useful if in terms of recruiting individuals, but since we're recruiting people, sometimes participants might be joining just because they want the money, or it may also not be very representative of the population because not everyone would have the time or would want to, get recruited. And it's usually only volunteers. It doesn't represent the entire population. What if there's a part of the population who's too anxious to bother getting recruited or isn't interested at all in the first place? So yeah, they might not represent that part of the population. Next up, we have credibility and generalizability. So we have construct validity, which is whether the definition is measurable, and it also asks like whether the operationalization has good quality, aka does like the behavior measure represents the concept they want to explore well. Like I said before, something like measuring how delinquent a teenager is to aggression would not be a good measurement of aggression because aggression is complicated. They have bad operationalization. And next we have internal validity. So this usually like focuses on the experiment design, like overall, like how well the experiment was controlled, or if the procedure is does the procedure may cause any bias, and etc. etc. Then we have external validity, which is whether the study can be generalized to other situations. We have population validity, where like the experiment can be generalized to population as a whole, or we also have ecological validity, where they measure how accurate the experiment represents a real life situation. Because sometimes there are times when, usually most of the time actually, when you have studies involving controlled experiments, very well controlled ones, they're usually very low in ecological validity. Like let's just say Glanzer and Kunitz study, which assesses your free recall. They usually just show you a presentation of a presentation of 15 words, and then they ask you to memorize it and recall it. I mean, that's not a very good representative of how memory works in real life and how short-term and long-term memory work, because that was what the experiment was about. But yeah, you don't, for short-term memory and long-term memory, you don't just look at several words and then memorize it. It's a lot more complex than that. Artificiality is when the situation created is unlikely to occur, that one has to wonder if there's any validity in the findings. This pertains more to like the general overall theory itself. So like if you have like some ridiculous controversial statements, then you have to consider whether like that statement is valid or artificial, because apparently in psychology sometimes there are like the most ridiculous things can happen when you're trying to study about like correlation of something. I don't remember what, but there are some really ridiculous associations that can happen in some studies. Next up, we have bias for quantitative studies. Oh, some of these biases, by the way, can be overlapping with the qualitative ones. So you don't have to remember all of them, but it can be very helpful for you to know. Actually, technically, you would need them for paper 3, but I don't, like, most of the time, some of these things doesn't happen. So you can just memorize, like, the more common ones and maybe overlap them with the qualitative biases. Okay, so we have selection. Selection is when the sample itself already have different characteristics in the first place. This happens when like when the sampling might not be very random. So maybe like in the first, when you have like an experiment, it might be that you divide participants in a way that control tends to be less well educated, while the experimental studies might be more well educated because of a certain condition that you set, or certain criteria that you set, which causes the sample to be unbalanced in the first place. Then we have history. So history is like the outside events that might influence an experiment. So let's say, for example, when you're doing an experiment at someone's house versus a lab, there might be differences in that. Maturation is when participants improve or decrease because of natural development or fatigue. So that this happens when you're like learning a new skill, or when you're training for something, when your participants is training for something for an experiment. Maybe they just improve because they train more, and that's like a normal thing, or they might be less. They might be worsening because of tiredness or fatigue. Testing effect. Oh, this is when the first dependent variable may affect the following dependent variables. So this is kind of like when you do a test on your participants and then you show them the results, and they might feel happier or they might feel disappointed about the results, and then you ask them to do the test again. And if you do that, like if you show the results and they have a particular feeling or belief of how well they did, and then you ask them to do the same thing again, then they might have beliefs about their result, and that might affect their next result. So maybe the confident people might be more careless. The less confident people might be more anxious, so their quality, like their results worsen, or maybe a lot of things can happen. Regression to the mean. So regression to the mean is probably when you don't really have a control group, and then you found like there are extreme score differences. This is more related to like statistical tendencies. I don't think we're gonna use this very often, so I think we don't have to go into depth about it. Experiment mortality is when the dropouts may affect the experiments if the dropouts are random. So there are some experiments where like certain characteristics of people may drop out because of like the certain conditions of the experiment. And if there's a lot of people who does that, then some people are not going to be represented well, and that might affect the results. Then demand characteristics is when participants influences the experiment by guessing the aim of the study. There's expectancy effects, screwy effects, social desirability effects. So these are like the 3 different responses of how people would respond if they think they finally guessed the aim of the study. Expectancy effect is when they try to help the researcher. Screw effect is when they try to rebel kind of against like the actual result in purpose. Social desirability is when they try to answer like potential good responses, so they might look good in front of the researchers. Then we also have researcher bias, where let's just say if the researcher is the one who's judging a particular behavior, it might be that the researchers were expecting the results to be true, so they unconsciously change it, like they unconsciously interpret the results in a way that it's significant. However, it might be that, it's affected by them. So to prevent this, they usually do double-blind control. And then participant variability, which we already talked about before. The characteristics of the sample effects, the dependent variable. Next up, we have the types of experiments. We have true experiments, where they use control groups. And they also usually over-rationalize the IV and DV. So they give a description of how like one thing to another is measured. And they also usually randomly allocate participants to conditions. Furthermore, they're also very standardized because they have to make sure they control the experiment. So the good thing about true experiments is that usually its cause and effect can be inferred from the study, so we can know what causes what behavior to happen. And it's also standardized, which means that you can repeat the study or you can replicate or repeat the study easily. But most of the time, because it's very controlled, unfortunately, it usually have low ecological validity because it's not, a control condition is not representative of how real life works. Next up, we have quasi experiments. Quasi experiments are similar to true experiments, except the IV, instead of manipulating it, they usually group it on trait or behavior. So, usually this works with they try to group it in by their race or by their age, by their gender, or maybe by their genes, like anything that's grouped from their existing traits. This may have good external validity since they're grouped in certain traits. So the study can be representative of these certain traits or behaviors. But it doesn't show direct causation. It only usually implies causation. The reason why this is the case is because usually the behaviors are already set in stone. Like, for example, let's just say gender and brain structure. Like, guys and girls have different brain structures. And, well, it might imply that you can imply the fact that the different brain structure causes the behavioral differences between guys and girls. But you can't just say, oh, because guys have this kind of brain and girls have this kind of brain difference, and they have these kind of brain differences because they have these kind of brain differences, that means that they behave like this and they behave like that. No, you cannot do that. You can only say, oh, it may be that because of that, but we don't know exactly that it directly affects it. Because it might be that, oh, it's actually because of environmental situation, or because it might be more complicated than just the brain causing the behavior. It also may have selection bias if they're grouped by trait or behavior, because sometimes some traits or behaviors are linked with certain other certain characteristics, and that might change. That might have confounding variables that comes with it. And then next we have natural experiments. So natural experiments are usually experiments that are outside researchers' control. The independent variable can't be controlled, and the behavior is measured before and after the variable is introduced. So these are usually studies that are I'd say something like a study involving coronavirus would be a natural study, because a study involving lockdown would be a natural experiment, because you don't really have a choice but to stay confined in your room when the lockdown happens, and that is outside researchers' control. But it allows researchers to disregard internal validities that happens when the lockdown happens. And since these are one of a lifetime kind of things, if you get stressed under a lockdown situation where you have to stay home all day, the researchers can observe this, and that would be fine because they didn't cause this to happen, and because if they cannot cause this to happen, since it would be unethical to do so. But it doesn't show direct causation either, but it may imply causation between IV and DV. And it also may be expensive and time-consuming, and it would be hard to replicate because these kind of things happens like once in a lifetime. Next up, we have field experiments where you try to manipulate the IVs. So, like for example, you make a scene without telling people, and then you observe the behaviors of the people when that happens. That's a field experiment. It usually have high ecological validity since it's conducted in real life, and very low demand characteristics since they don't know that happens. But it has ethical concerns with informed consent and debriefing because you're just doing it out of nowhere and observing people without asking them, and that's a violation of privacy. And they didn't consent for it, didn't volunteer for it. This usually also can't be easily replicated since you can't replicate a natural traffic jam with like these strangers. No, you can't do that. And you also cannot control confounding variables. So like, let's say there are certain people in a certain area. So like if you do an experiment, a similar experiment in different kind of areas, then the response, depending on the time, the day, might be different with different people, and that can be a confounding variable. Okay, so correlational studies. Yeah, after experiments, we have correlational studies, where we see the relationship between two or more variables. So we have positive, negative, and zero correlation. Positive correlation is usually directly correlated. So like in this picture, you see X increase, Y increase. Well, for negative, we have X increase, Y decrease. Then for zero correlation, we have no correlation, basically. Correlational studies has this thing called Bi-Directional Ambiguity. Basically, there's no cause and effect, there's only a link between them. There's an association, and we don't know which variable is responsible to which, or it might be, there might be a different variable that's affecting both of them that is responsible for the link of this. Effect size and statistical significance. You don't even need this in your studies, but might as well explain it. So usually there's like the coefficient effect size, correlation coefficient effect size. It measures whether like there's a lot of spread or there's a little spread between like the relationship of the two variables. So the numbers range from like -1 to 0 to 1. So if the number is closer to 0, that means that it's closer to a zero correlation. So, however, if a number gets closer to 1 or -1, let's just say if the number is closer to 1, that means it would be a positive correlation. So the variables is like less spread and closer to the line, the correlation line. And then for negative, it's basically the same thing as -1 is the same thing as like positive, except it's a different. One is positive direct relationship. One is an inverse relationship. Yeah. Then there's also a statistical significance, which is determined by the p-value. So the thing with data is that when you use when you like take data, there are chances that the correlation, this kind of correlation that you found, like the data of the correlation, has a chance of like being random. I'm not sure if I explained that correctly. So, okay, let's just say that we found out that aggression is linked to genetics, like positively correlated to genetics. I don't know. Yeah, I'm just making these kind of things up, so please don't take my word by word. Yeah, let's just say aggression is positively correlated to genetics, and they found that the correlation is very high, like very close to 1, so it's like 0.95 or something, yeah. But we don't know if the result that you get, since this is taken by a sample, we don't know if this result might be just, it just happens that you take a certain sample that has like these extreme results, or you don't know if this is actually representative of the sample. So to see if the results you get have a high chance of being random or a low chance of being like a random significant results out of like random. This is actually more maths, my bad. Yeah. To see whether it's like significance is by high key by chance, or the significance is not very high key by chance, you want to do statistical significance. So the smaller the p-value is, the less likely that it's by chance. But the higher the p-value is, the more likely that your result is by chance. So it's not significant if it is. Yeah, and both of them combined determines the effect and dependability of the results. It's usually better to have a significant high correlation instead of, actually no, that's subjective, never mind. Yeah, but like the thing with high significant correlation, that it's like a safer, you can establish like a safer conclusion than low significant correlation with low significant high correlation. Yeah, that's for like that kind of result. You still cannot really conclude a lot of things unless if you do more experiments to make sure that you have like a high significant correlation. Next up, we have limitations of causation. You have no cause and effect, which I explained before, and then we also have biases, which is the third variable problem, which I also explained before-ish, and curvilinear relationships. So basically, if the scatter plot results in a curve, which is, you know how like curves are usually natural occurrences. Like let's just say when you're trying to measure the grades of students in an IB class, then the results of their grades would be like a grading curve. Like a lot of people are going to have an average grade, and there's going to be the extremes who got good grades, the extremes who got bad grades. That's a curvilinear relationship. And usually the scatter plot, if the scatter plot results in something like that, correlation lines, like for these kind of lines, they can't capture it. They would think, oh, your result is not significant. Your results are very scattered, all apart. Doesn't make sense. Then we also have spurious correlations, well, where the correlation that happens may be by chance. Since if you measure a lot of correlations, this is more of a like modeling thing. If you measure a lot of data in a model, there might be a chance that the model might start interpreting and grouping the data, and that might cause a correlation that happens like because of like the model starting to group the data on its own ish. So you should be careful with interpreting correlations with a lot of data. For correlation studies, sampling is similar, and usually for generalizability, since you don't really conduct an experiment, you're just looking at the link between the two variables. They only care about your sample representativeness and how it relates to the population. And last but not least, in quantitative studies, we also have descriptive studies. So for descriptive studies, you don't really you don't do experiments, you just measure the studies and you go in depth and approach how each of the variables are like before you start doing correlation experiments or experimental designs, because you obviously don't want to make like really irrelevant or theories that are not backed up by anything, like backed up by evidence, and like to prevent that and to prevent yourself from wasting your time making experiments that are not relevant and already proven wrong, you have to start with descriptive studies. Okay, next time we're going to qualitative. But before we go into qualitative, I'm just going to give around like 5-minute to 10-minute break. So yeah. Okay, I'm gonna. Alright, so I've explained about what qualitative studies were before, and now I'm just going to like get into the strengths and the limitations of qualitative studies. So I see. Okay, so qualitative studies are good if you have the purpose of like getting really in depth about like rich subjective experiences, because usually in psychology behaviors are very complex, right? There's a lot of things that's going on. So and usually studies like quantitative studies are quite reductionist. So it would be very good if you have like a mix of qualitative studies and quantitative studies. And usually like going in depth about these behaviors is where the qualitative study comes in. So the good side of qualitative studies is that it provides rich data, in-depth descriptions of concepts, meanings, people's intentions, behavior, etc. The interesting part of psychology. And it's also particularly useful for investigating complex and sensitive issues, like when you're coping with mental illnesses, human sexuality, homelessness, or living in a violent relationship. You know, you want, like when you really want to know in depth about what happened, qualitative is a good deal. It also explains phenomenons of what happens. So instead of you can go like way beyond like observing what people do. So instead of observing like, oh, so a person, let's just say like in in coronavirus condition right now, a person loses their job, they get homeless, they become poor, they start stealing food. That's very descriptive, and that's like observing from far away. But in qualitative experiments, you can actually observe like the context of people losing their jobs, and then maybe the motivations behind why they become poor and why they start stealing food, and etc. Yeah, and basically identify, evaluate the factors behind the issue. And getting into depth in these kind of things can generate new ideas and theories to explain and overcome the problems. Because sometimes you can get unexpected outcomes from getting in depth. And people are also usually studied in their own environment, which also increases their validity. However, doing this can be very time-consuming, and you're going to generate a huge amount of data. And since this is not reduced into numbers, data analysis can be difficult because most of the time, when you have like a lot of data here and there, there's no clear strategy to deal with the data unless if there's a previous experiment who already helps you like explain about how to deal with the data-ish. So it would be a great challenge, and the interpretation of data may be subjective. And this is an important thing when you do qualitative studies, because what we believe can, and we as a person, if we were researchers and we do qualitative studies, our cultural backgrounds, our beliefs can really highly affect how we interpret the data or the people that are involved in the study. So it can be very subjective, and sometimes it can be very biased. And sometimes, if you're the one doing it, we don't know that you're being biased unless if maybe someone else points it out. Or if there are several perspectives which can help support it, into a more holistic perspective on the subject. Okay, so now in qualitative experiments, we have several types of sampling. We have quota sampling, which is where you keep on recruiting participants with the desired characteristic until you get a certain proportion of the sample that you want, or a certain sample size that you want. And then you also have propositive sampling, where you look for participants with the characteristics you want, recruit them, and while not considering about the proportion and sample size. So you just want to observe them, or maybe you just want to interview with these people. As long as there are people, that's enough. And there's also theoretical sampling. So basically, keep on trying to collect data, as much data as possible, until there's no new information obtained from new participants. This usually depends on the theory used in the study, and generally relates to theoretical generalizability. And then next we have snowball sampling, where participants are asked to invite their friends who fulfills the desired characteristics of the study. So usually this happens in studies where there are not enough resources to pick participants, or where it's hard to reach out to the participants because of their certain characteristics, let's say something like someone, when you're trying to look for drug dealers or communities who are very influenced, with a very highly influenced with drug experiences, or maybe community who's very influenced by weed usage, those kind of communities are usually harder to reach out to. So scientists usually just try to find find a friend and then ask them to invite their friends if possible. And then there's also convenient sampling, which is using easily accessible studies like white college freshmen or rats. Yeah, okay, maybe not rats, but yeah, but you get what I mean. Next up, we have generalizability, which is how much the findings can reflect reality, or how trustworthy the studies are. Because, yeah, it's a subjective thing. So you have to consider the triangulation of the study. So triangulation is basically a combination of different approaches in getting and interpreting the data. The more triangulation there is, the more credible it is. Because it's basically like taking account of different perspectives and combining them together to make a more solid subjective approach, instead of like being very biased to a certain interpretation. It can be done through the method, the data, the researcher, and the theory. So different methods like combination of quantitative and qualitative methods. Data is using different documents to study them. So let's say if you're interviewing someone with a mental illness, then other than looking at their interview, you can also look at their medical history, maybe their relationships with their friends, their parents, and etc. And then researcher is basically combining different interpretations from different researchers. Well, theory is basically using multiple perspectives to evaluate the data and see how they combine and maybe form a conclusion from like the combination of the theories. And there's also a report, which is basically something crucial that researchers should try to do. So especially in something like interviews, researchers should make sure that participants are trying to be honest, and they should also make sure that participants know that what they're doing is voluntary and they don't feel like they're being judged, or they don't feel like they're being wronged if they say anything or if they do anything that they normally behave in. So they don't try to alter their behavior to seem desirable in front of the researcher. Okay, next we have iterative questioning. So basically, iterative questioning is certain topics with sensitive responses are asked with rephrasings to get a deeper insight. So instead of using the same phrases, you try to like modify the words that you use so that it doesn't maybe there are some circumstances where some words can be like more triggering than other words. So different rephrasings can sometimes allow a participant to talk more about the particular thing that's sensitive to them, and maybe help them open up more. The next time we have reflexivity. This is where the researchers reflect on the possibilities of the bias made. This is more on the researcher side, where they reflect on the possible strengths and limitations they might have made using the methods they use, or they can also reflect on their personal beliefs, their cultural background, their expectations that can be affecting how they interpret data. Then a way to confirm the credibility would be through credibility checks. Basically, for example, if you have an interview, you want to check the accuracy of it by asking participants to maybe like review the transcripts and confirm or give clarifications to what they say, so that there's no, so you can minimize the misinterpretation that may have happened. Last but not least, we have tick descriptions. So it's basically, you want that tick-rich detail when you explain a situation, like, if possible, every single detail of it. You want that juicy descriptions, so people can understand the context and hopefully get more of an holistic insight to what's happening. Then next up we have generalizability. Okay, so for this, it's according to Firestone in 1993. There are 3 types of generalizability: sample to population generalizability, which is whether you can generalize your results to a sample. You can generalize your results to target population, to the population you actually wanted to look at. And then next we have theoretical generalizability. So kind of like when you want to generalize your results to a theory, so you kind of want to relate your results to the described theory that you have. And this is only possible if you manage to achieve data saturation, aka you don't find anything else that's new. And it's usually also be able to be used to develop a further theory about the matter. Next, we have case-to-case generalizability, which is basically whether the study can be transferred to a new situation or a different setting, like similar settings. For example, in the case of H.M. Milner, he lost a part of his brain, and psychologists and scientists decided to observe his behavior that's associated to that part of the brain loss. And if you want to transfer like his situation, maybe you can transfer his situation to another case where someone else's part, like the same part of the brain, got damaged. So you can maybe like try to compare the situation that's happening to see if there are similarities in like the overall behavior. And then next we have bias. There are 2 types of biases that comes from like different perspectives. The first is participant bias. The second is researcher bias. So participant bias, you have acquiescence bias, which is the tendency for someone to give positive or like more optimistic answers for whatever reason. This is usually done like especially if you're facing a stranger. So researchers usually try to avoid this by making like more open-ended questions and questions with neutral wordings, and try to make sure that like the questions are more focused on the participants' opinions instead of asking for what the participant think the general society would say. Then next we have social desirability bias, which is a tendency to respond in a socially likable or accepted way, because humans tend to respond in a more socially desirable way to get themselves liked more. And to deal with this, researchers usually avoid this by phrasing it in like a less judgmental way, or phrasing it to third person. So like, what would he do if he were to do this, or what do you think should he do if blah blah blah. Sometimes that can like reflect what their actual answers would be. Or there's also the dominant respondent bias, where in group interviews, there are one participant who tends to be more dominant when they're talking, and this might influence or convince other participants to behave in a certain way or certain response. So let's just say something like, okay, this is probably borderline like joke, but let's just say the presidential election debate. Like in the debate, Donald Trump was like trying to hijack Joe Biden's chances to talk most of the time and try to like show dominance. And that's not a good thing in interviews because that might influence other people in general. And to prevent this from happening, researchers should be trained to keep participants in check and to allow everyone to get a chance to talk, like to keep in track everyone's participation and allow them to feel safe about it. And last, we have sensitivity bias, which is a tendency to distort responses in sensitive topics. Usually, so when you talk about something sensitive, you might be more emotionally affected. So it might like affect how you respond when you're not in the right mind to talk about it, or if it pertains something that like affects you in a negative way. So to prevent that from happening, building a good rapport and trust can help encourage them to be more calm or like less negative when trying to open up. And then next we have researcher bias. First up, we have confirmation bias. This is when researchers have a prior belief about something and they try to attempt to confirm the belief instead of trying to falsify the belief unintentionally. And this is usually something that like you can't avoid because humans tend to try to confirm to their beliefs. And to tackle with this, usually reflexivity can be done to take confirmation bias into account. And then here's the leading questions bias, where when researchers try to phrase something in a certain way, respondents would be inclined to respond to it because of the wordings of it. So, like an example of the study of Loftus and Palmer, the usage of different verbs like using smash and hit can apparently encourage respondents to respond more dramatically and etc. depending on like the words that's used. So researchers should be trained to ask more neutral, open-ended questions and try to word it in participants' language. So instead of using the language that may influence participants' responses. Next, we have question order bias. So question order bias is when a question influences participants' responses to other questions. Humans tend to be more consistent. Humans tend to want to be more consistent in responding to their beliefs and their actions. This is basically to prevent this from happening. General questions should be asked before specific questions, positive questions before negative, and behavior before attitude. So you should go from the more general one and start to like slowly probe deeper from there on. Next, we have sampling bias. So there are this may happen when you have convenient sampling. So basically, the sample isn't adequate for research aims. This probably happens when you try to like recruit random people to talk about a certain topic. The person might not always have knowledge on the matter, so they might have sampling bias from it. And then finally we have bias reporting. So this is again like something similar to confirmation bias. Basically, the findings of the study isn't equally represented in the research report. Like, for example, if you highly support a particular outcome, you're like very expectant to one outcome. You do mention the negative or like the things that might falsify the outcome that you want, but then you only briefly mention it or briefly cover it, and then like maybe just one paragraph, and then like the rest of the paragraphs are all about supporting what you want to talk about, and that would be bias reporting. So reflexivity, integrity, and training can help reduce this tendency to be biased. Okay. I think now we're going to the last part of the qualitative research subtopic, which is the qualitative research methods. First, we have observation. Observation is basically when you describe behavior, you look at them, you describe them, if possible, describe them very juicily or very in depth without establishing cause and effect relationship. This usually focuses on how people interact, interpret each other's behavior, and how people react to it. Usually, like in terms of usually in terms of like insight to like a certain behavior, you would need observation. And it also allows you to be very immersed in the setting and get like the first-hand experience and know how someone behaves. It also allows researchers to like generate a lot of data from the behavior observed in a real-life setting, and maybe even catch up on the nuances of the behavior if the researchers like pays a lot of attention. However, this can also be prone to researcher bias because it's a subjective interpretation of from someone's lens. So there are several types of observation. There's the lab or naturalistic. Basically, naturalistic is anything that's outside the labs. The laboratory observation is something that's done in the labs. Then there's also overt or covert observation. Basically, overt is when participants know they're being observed, while covert is when participants don't know they're being observed. And there's also participant and non-participant observation. Participant is when researchers become part of the observed group. So maybe if they want to analyze about tribal behavior, and then they go into like they join and live a part of the tribe, that would be participant observation. Non-participant is when they observe it from far away. And there's also structured and unstructured observation. So structured observation is when it is done with like a checklist of behaviors. So maybe if you already anticipate the behaviors, or you want to like find out what kind of behaviors can you observe, you already have a list. But then there's also unstructured behavior, is when like whatever behavior that seems interesting or noteworthy is written down by the researchers, so it's kind of like all up to them. Next we have interviews. So interviews comes in the form of video or audio recording, which then gets converted into interview transcripts, And sometimes it also includes interview notes. Like, this is probably like the interview notes are probably like observations of like particular phenomenon that happened during the interview. The good side of interviews is that you can get into the subjective nature of the experiences. So you can hear a perspective of someone talking about like their real experience of a particular thing. And it also helps you understand the context behind events, like people's motives of why they want to do this, their perspective on this. And it's also useful to talk about sensitive topics. However, this face-to-face interaction usually have like tiny nuances in non-verbal communication that may affect the overall interview results. So yeah, like there are a lot of biases that can happen when you're facing a participant with a researcher. Okay, there are 3 types of interviews. There are the structured interviews, basically where researchers already plan all the questions, so it's easy to analyze and compare the results with others. This may seem a bit artificial since the interview is going to be very stiff and inflexible, and the questions can seem impersonal or irrelevant because it may be that the participants might not want to talk about X topic, but then they ended up delving into the X topic. Next up, we have semi-structured interviews. Well, this is where you have like a certain set of questions that are open-ended, and it allows free response where researchers can ask more about the particular thing if the researchers want to probe deeper into it. But they also have to try to maintain the focus on the interview if possible. Then we also have unstructured interviews. So this is where they only have one topic and they only have topic and time, and participants are allowed to talk more in the unstructured interview because it's like as long as you talk about this topic, you can talk about whatever you want. And then after interviews, we also have focus groups. Focus groups are similar to interviews. However, it's done in a group of people, and it's usually semi-structured interview. Usually, the interviewer may serve as like a facilitator or a moderator, and then the interviewees, the participants, are encouraged to interact with each other. Usually, when this happens, it doesn't feel as like stiff as interviews because it's like conversing with someone else, and it's also a good way to get information from several participants at once. So you get like different perspectives at once, and maybe it's easier to respond to sensitive questions in a group, because if you're in a group like and they experience like similar situations, then it feels like, oh yeah, we've experienced this, all of us, so we can understand. So it's easier to respond. And then and also multiple perspectives. However, with several people talking together, there's sometimes dominant respondent bias and conformity effect. Since there's going to be someone who's going to be try to be dominant in responding to the questions. And it's also harder to preserve anonymity and confidentiality because several people are going to talk at once, and they're going to know each other, like whether you like it or not. And sampling an interview transcript can also be demanding because if several people talk at once, sometimes it can be a mess. There can be in worst situations, worst case scenarios, there might be several people talking at once, and there might be like 2 people talking together while others like join in the group, and like just imagine trying to transcribe that. Okay, 4 we have content analysis. This is more for like how to analyze interviews kind of thing. Yeah, how to systematically, oh no, it's not just interviews, it's also like observation text. This is like basically a checklist of how to analyze text in a rigorous manner. And one of them is inductive content analysis. It's a way to derive recurring themes in the text that's intended to be analyzed. So first, we have writing transcript. So you want to transcript the entire thing. There can be 2 types of writing transcripts. There can be verbatims, which is word per word account. Then there's also postmortem, where they count word for word and with interview notes about intonation, gesture, other nonverbal behaviors. So that's like a bit of mix of observation and interviews. The next, after writing the transcript, researchers start rereading the transcript and start to draw. Oh, who's that? Rex, is that you? I was like really shocked when this. Okay, well, it's okay. Like, next we have reading the raw material. So researchers start rereading it and start to identify some themes that they can find in the text, and they try to revise it several times with different researchers, so they can like derive several themes and have different perspectives on it. And then after deriving like several of these low-level themes, they start grouping the themes into big themes, like the general big ideas of them. So they try to like maybe discuss, or they start comparing each other to see like which teams can be compared, and this discussion or this comparison can help increase the credibility of whether these teams are good to be compared together or not. And next we have the summary of the teams, which is where they create a table of teams which is prepared with evidence from the transcript. So now the theme can only be changed slightly, and they will keep on like revising and revising until data saturation or no new themes is emerging. In the end, after doing all these steps, they can formulate a conclusion from the summary table, and then they can link to links to the theory, and participants would sometimes be asked to confirm the analysis result, which is accompanied with like the memo, the notes of the observations, like the behaviors that they did. When a new theory is created from this inductive content analysis, it's called grounded theory. Basically, like forming a new theory that's grounded from inductive content analysis. Okay, last we have case studies. Case studies is an in-depth investigation of an individual or a group. So researchers would do whatever it takes to probe deep into the behavior of a certain person or a certain group, as long as it's ethical, and as long as it has good integrity. So the good side of using case study is that sampling and generalizability is not a problem, because they're no longer looking at samples, they're no longer looking at generalizability, they just want to go very deep into like this special case. And it's also usually done using multiple methods and often longitudinally. So they're going to use observations, interviews, experiments, all sorts of things as much as they could. It's very interesting because it allows researchers to study like special phenomenons or like special cases, like when one part of your brain goes better, like a part of your brain gets removed, and well, technically in real life situations you cannot do that because that's unethical, right? But since that already happened because like of a certain situation, let's just say the person's epileptic and they need to remove that part of the brain, they can finally have someone they can analyze on. Or in like maybe in other special cases, like there's this other case where this kid was abused and confined in a room for like years until they're 14 or 15, if I recall correctly. And since this is very unethical but very interesting, this finally allows researchers to study about them and like observe and maybe even develop new theories out of it, or even like clarify the existing theories that they have. The limitation about this is that researchers might get involved into a very long study with the participant, and this may cause researcher bias because you're going to be very involved with the participant. And participants may also know the researcher too well, so they become biased. So, and they may like behave in a certain way in front of the researchers because they're already kind of like friends, or you know, they're already like they know each other very well, like after a long time. And the bad side of this is also that case-to-case generalization can't be done because it's usually a very special case. So you can't just, oh yeah, I can relate this very concerning and traumatic situation to like average people. That's totally possible. No, that's you can't do that. It's also hard to ensure anonymity and confidentiality because when you have special cases, a lot of researchers is going to be like, whoa, I want to research this person. Well, I want, like, a lot of people are going to chase and want to study that person and get interested. And also because of this, there might be cases where, like, the participant is already reported by the media, like, because they found about the case because of the media sensation that like got reported, that reported like a certain criminal case or something like that. So most of the time, like, the participants' anonymity and confidentiality may have been exposed. Okay, now that is finally the end of our session. Thank you for joining for today's session.